Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Donald Trump based a large part of his campaign on demonizing the news media, and many journalists have described a climate change for reporters since he took office. But to be fair, news organizations have been facing mounting problems for many years, some of them of their own making. Now Joe Strupp, who has had 30 years of experience with news organizations, from traditional print to broadcast to the new media of the digital age, has written a book called Killing Journalism: How Greed, Laziness, and Donald Trump Are Destroying News and How We Can Save It. It's published by Willow Street Press, and I'm very pleased it has brought Joe Strupp to our show. Hi.
Thank you for having me.
There are places in the world where journalists really are being killed. How is journalism, as opposed to journalists, being killed?
That's a good point, and it's a slow death. And I don't think it's complete death yet. We're not dead yet, and I have still some hopes and hope, and not completely cynical, but it's been little by little in terms of financial, in terms of cutbacks in revenue for the news outlets, for cutbacks in reporting staff, and of course Donald Trump calling us the enemy of the people, among other things.
Could it be argued that journalism is simply evolving? How is this all that different from past eras when, say, radio challenged print and then television challenged both radio and print?
Because I think the quality is suffering. I think we're seeing more demand for eyeballs, for readership, for viewership, at the expense of the quality, the in-depth reporting, the investigative reporting, and a lot of the basic local and regional reporting.
And you mentioned that Donald Trump has called journalists enemies of the people. He also often frequently rails against fake news. How have journalists responded to those attacks?
I think there's a lot of response that's been good. I think they're digging in their heels. You see what Jim Acosta has done and others at press conferences, although I don't think what Acosta is doing is always right on, because I think he might go over the board a little bit. But a lot of the major outlets like New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and others are keeping up with the coverage and still trying to dig out the truth.
On the other hand, even the New York Times sometimes prints fake news. I'm still waiting for the New York Times to correct things it's published about me, and a number of former staffers wrote to the Times to refute the stories that they've published, but the letters never were published.
Yes.
So I don't want to go into that in any detail right now, but there's still fake news going on there, even from the most respected of the media.
Well, I think the term fake news that Trump likes to use looks at the idea that news outlets are purposely putting out untruth information and failing to correct it. You're right. In many cases, false things are reported. In most cases, legitimate outlets, the Times among them, are good to correct them. But in that case, maybe they didn't. You're right. No one's perfect, but I think the idea and the focus is still positive that they're trying to do the right thing.
Have journalists changed how they approach writing about politicians because of the climate since Donald Trump took office?
I think one of the things I think you have to look at is lumping everyone together. All journalists or all media people say the media or all reporters. There are bad reporters, there are good reporters, there are biased reporters. I think a lot of them have changed their focus, but I think a lot of it is this increased competition for an audience because we have such a splintered media, not only across print but online and on TV and radio. We have satellite radio now that has hundreds of stations. We have cable, has hundreds of stations. And the internet is essentially endless opportunity for location. So you really are battling more for your audience, and some people respond to that by just grabbing what will interest the viewer or the listener rather than really looking at what's important news.
One of the president's targets, CNN, recently announced that it was naming a conservative GOP operative, Sarah Isker, as a political editor. Do you think that's an attempt to placate complaints from
You'd
conservatives?
have to ask CNN, but it wouldn't surprise me, right?
CNN does try to create a sense of being fair. They often create panels that pit critics and supporters of the president against each other, and then there's a lot of talking over from both sides.
Right, and you see that at other places, obviously. You see that at MSNBC. You see that on local news channels in some places. And I think the problem isn't necessarily having one side or the other. I do get into the book about false equivalency, which is another sort of piece of that. But in general, I think it's a negative because it replaces reporting with just talking heads and arguing rather than bringing out more facts and information.
Let's talk about false equivalency.
Yeah.
If I say one thing and you say another thing, they don't equal each other.
Not always when you're talking about certain issues. You're talking about climate change. Most of the science has climate change as a reality. Much of it, if not most of it, has it as being man-made. So news outlets will bring on someone who says, no, the climate change isn't real. Well, the science says in most cases it is. Other things have been brought forth with gay rights for many years. There was the anti-gay crowd who would bring up claims about gays and lesbians that just weren't true, but people like Tony Perkins at the Family Research Council still gets a spot. I saw him recently being put up on Fox News Radio, and this man has just a history of inaccuracies, and that's one of the problems when you have two sides, and one of them really isn't valid, but news outlets allow them to be placed.
One of the most amusing examples of this is the woman that Donald Trump has just named to be a UN representative. When she was asked about climate change, she said, well, I believe the scientists on both sides. And when they try to get her to be more specific, she just kept on repeating that as though that answered the question.
Right, and when you allow people to just make comments like that, or even have a position at the table in a panel discussion that has a side that really has no basis, it falls short of the goal of news, which is to present accurate information.
Is it possible that Trump has energized news organizations in some ways? He's been a major source of material for the late-night comedy shows.
Yes, and I think news outlets have brought some success out of what he's done inadvertently. The New York Times, and a lot of news outlets and newspapers have seen subscription increases. Viewership is up.
MSNBC's ratings went up.
Absolutely, all of them. Not just Fox, but all of the news outlets and big newspapers have seen an increase, and a lot of them have seen an increase in coverage. The Times and Washington Post added more journalists to cover the White House, and they're getting more reaction and more readership and viewership.
But has that changed all that much over the years? For example, it's often pointed out that certain people only watch Fox and other people only watch MSNBC. And I remember a time when the newspapers in New York were either staunchly Democrat, the New York Post, staunchly Republican, the Herald Tribune and the Journal American, and people tended to, or the Daily News, I think, was also went both ways. People tended to buy the newspaper that confirmed their beliefs. How has anything changed?
Right. That was often the case in the past when there were multiple newspapers, even greater than today. It's sort of morphed, and I do a whole chapter on journalism history as well. It's sort of morphed into more of an even-handed approach. In the 60s and 70s, a lot of the Watergate fallout had newspapers and news outlets trying to bring out the investigative end and the reporting end of what was going on rather than one side or the other. But now that has divided up people more, where you go to an outlet, whether it's MSNBC, Fox, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, that you agree with. And when you're online and you're only seeing certain stories and only certain pieces of the news rather than opening the paper and sort of scanning it the way I like to still do and many people do, you do get that division, and you get a side you agree with and maybe only stories you think are interesting rather than getting exposed to a lot of other ideas and stories that you might not have known about otherwise.
I've read any number of articles that said that the goal is objectivity in reporting.
Yes.
But then other articles say it's impossible to be objective when you're reporting.
I think I take a stand against that. Maybe I'm naive, although I've been a reporter for 30 years, and I always try to bring the objective, fair story. I get more of a kick and more of a high out of breaking a good story and doing it well. I think most journalists and many of them I spoke to for the book agree. Sure, there are people who have one-sided views, but doesn't mean they have to do it in their professional life. I always say, if you have a plumber or a doctor or a lawyer who is a conservative or liberal, are they going to treat their patient or client who is the opposite of their view differently? No, I don't think. And I think most journalists take that approach. We take a pride in bringing out the whole story. Are we human? Yes. But I think in general they're trying to do the right thing, and if they're not, they shouldn't be in the business.
Haven't most politicians complained about the press over our history?
Yes.
Thomas Jefferson, the man behind the Bill of Rights, in 1806, in the midst of his second term, he wrote to a Massachusetts congressman, "As for what is not true, you will always find abundance in the newspapers." And then he urged the state attorney generals in New England to prosecute newspaper editors for sedition.
Yes. And the Alien and Sedition Act was one of those that went against news outlets. But there were newspapers that were the first to publish the Declaration of Independence in support of what they were trying to do. So they worked for the newspapers. And you're right, there's been many cases, and back to Richard Nixon, but even the Obama
He tried to
administration.
revoke CBS's broadcast licenses as the Watergate scandal grew.
Right, and that was something also the Washington Post's television stations were facing difficulties at the time. And even the Obama administration was not very good about giving information to reporters. I think every news outlet has found that each presidential administration has been more secretive than the one before.
James Risen, who reported on domestic surveillance during the administrations of George W. Bush and Barack Obama, said that he thought that President Obama was the most anti-journalism president we'd had, although that was before Donald Trump was elected.
Right, and Risen had to face that wrath, and
he was suppressed. His reports were suppressed.
But it wasn't brought out as much as with Trump, because Obama wasn't saying there was fake news and the enemy of the people. He didn't go so far out to make it a public issue, but behind the scenes, the White House was trying to control coverage just as much as any others, and that's what they've done throughout their history, correct?
Do politicians who attack journalism hope to nudge or force more favorable coverage?
I think that's part of it, but I think nowadays, you look at Trump in a different sphere than a lot of presidents before him. He takes it to a whole other level. He's very open about it. He's trying to feed his certain base, but it does have a detrimental effect because it sparks a lot of actual violence and physical abuse of reporters in many cases, as we've seen. That we really haven't seen, even in the Nixon era. Although if you go back to the revolutionary times, obviously there was that kind of approach, but that's 200 plus years ago. Hopefully we've come a little farther.
As when they attack the press, are they scoring points with voters?
You're talking about who? Presidents in general? I think they're scoring votes with their supporters, especially Trump, who's, his core supporters are not fans of the press and never have been, in many ways because of what he said about the press, and most of it inaccurate.
I'm speaking to Joe Strupp, S-T-R-U-P-P, his latest book, Killing Journalism, How Greed, Laziness, and Donald Trump Are Destroying News, and How We Can Save It. It's from Willow Street Press, and this is Leonard Lopate at Large on WBAI, New York, 99.5 FM. Conservatives often attack the press as left-leaning.
Yes.
In your view, does the American press tend to lean one way or another politically?
I think what a lot of people see as left-leaning or liberal is an open view of ideas, and I write about that in the book, that a good journalist has to be willing to look at any idea or belief or way of life that they may not agree with, and I think a conservative view narrows that more in general. And the liberal view is more willing to talk about not only gay rights many years ago and civil rights, but things to the most bizarre. We're talking about things, this Robert Kraft story this week raised the issue of prostitution. Some people say prostitution should be legal. Marijuana is now getting legal. Issues that a lot of conservative people just don't accept, when I think a liberal mind will at least listen to it and consider it, and part of that is a piece of journalism, is to look at all the views and to cover something without an opinion or a judgment and say, look, this is what's going on, this is the issue, this is the event, this is the argument, and here is what's involved with it, rather than sort of judging it as being negative from the beginning.
Well, I think people pick and choose. For example, I saw a report yesterday on television about the Robert Kraft situation, where people in Boston were interviewed, and they all said, "Oh, it's nothing." These are the same people who I suspect would have been screaming bloody murder if it had been, I don't know, either the owner of another team or perhaps some kind of a liberal politician.
Right, and I heard someone compare it to Tiger Woods being the real problem with his golf game in his career when he had his big run-in with his wife and all his affairs came out. Some people were pointing out properly that what Tiger Woods did wasn't illegal. What Robert Kraft did was illegal. And there's also another piece of his story, obviously, that involves potential human trafficking and really serious illegal activity that's been unproven. But the way people approach it is kind of interesting. And there is also the sports aspect that if you're a fan, you're going to look at it a certain way versus a news story. But I think that's just one example of how people look at certain issues and have their own viewpoints. But the fact that the journalism gets brought out as it does is what's important.
With newspapers, it's often easy to tell where the newspaper stands just through the headlines. And this is nothing new either. My history teacher in high school pointed out that when Alf Landon was running against FDR and the news was supporting FDR and the Herald Tribune was supporting Alf Landon, the Trib headline was Alf Landon speaks before 5,000 at Madison Square Garden, and the news was Alf Landon speaks before a half-filled garden.
Which were
both were true.
Possibly true, absolutely. And that's the interesting aspect of it. I teach some courses in journalism, and I was just speaking with my class earlier today about the Hearst-Pulitzer War in the early 1900s over the Spanish-American War and the explosion aboard the USS Maine that was considered to be an attack by both papers when it wasn't, and how that led us into the war. And those were real, true, I won't say biases, but seeking a mission of the newspaper. And there was a lot of inaccuracy, too, which is never defensible in my view. And I think less of that at a broad scope today, but obviously there are pieces of it that could be brought out, especially we're in New York with the tabloids here that have clear opinions. Especially the Daily News has gone so far left in recent years. It's very interesting. They're counter to the New York Post, which is obviously conservative.
Yeah, well, I think when the Post started publishing in the morning, the News felt it had to offer an alternative. Yeah. But they're suffering. Didn't they lay off half of their staff?
Not unlike every newspaper in the print world, and especially the tabloids, which have such a history of being street papers and being read on the subway and in the cafes, and people aren't reading newspapers in print anymore. If when they are reading them, they're reading them a lot online. And I don't know how the New Yorker who's on the subway reads online if they're underground and get that signal knocked in. They still have to read the print. But you're right. That's the problem that most newspapers are facing now is simply that readership.
And you don't find newspapers left on the seat in the subway these days.
Because people aren't having
the old days, I used to love it, and then I did the crossword puzzle. Do you think the press spends too much time on Donald Trump? And am I spending too much time on Donald Trump in this conversation?
I think it's an interesting question, and I go into
He
that.
is in the title of your book.
Yes, and he's in the first chapter, Trumped. He's in several others, although I want to also point out most of the book is not about him, but he does have to play into a lot of it because of who he is and what he does. I think we have such an unusual situation with Trump. We've never had a president like him who's so outspoken, who's so difficult with the press, who attacks them so fiercely and so inaccurately. But I think they're trying to cover him objectively, and I think they have to because there's so much news involved. But you're right, they can overdo it. I go in the book about how MSNBC now is essentially Trump all day unless there's some big alleged breaking story, and you really don't need to cover him all day, but they believe and probably know that people will watch, even if it's barely a new element of his presidency.
It's been argued that the press actually made Donald Trump the major candidate because they devoted so much space to him.
They did, and there's data in the book. A lot of it I got from the Shorenstein Center and from the Pew Research Center, which are great outlets. Go to their websites. You see all the data. That coverage of Trump in the primaries and after far outstripped any other candidates or campaigns. And a lot of it was not so much favorable, but very down the middle, where they would leave cameras on his rallies, as we know, and let him spout all his lies. And the two that I really look at are Mika and Joe on Morning Joe, who were his buddies. People forget they had him on. They were oohing and eyeing and supporting him, and then it just switched one day when he attacked Mika Brzezinski, and now they attack him regularly, acting as though they had nothing to do with helping him get the fame he got.
Wasn't Joe Scarborough a Republican?
He was a Republican congressman, yes.
So he has moved far away from where his roots were. Beyond Donald Trump, what would you say are the most significant changes over the past 20, 30 years in coverage of news?
I think a lot of it is the advertising that was lost when the Internet first came about in the 90s and the late 90s and the early 2000s. Google and Facebook now have majority of the advertising dollar online and even overall.
Even though I never look at the ads?
But they're there, and they're stuffed ahead farther than you even know. And so they were losing advertising to the Internet. They were losing advertising to other outlets. And then there was a recession in the early 2000s, and they didn't really know how to counter it. A lot of news outlets also put news up online for free, although most of them charge in some way now. That lost a lot of audience because the way the Internet was structured, people were used to getting free news. Now I think they're realizing they do have to pay for it, but there was a lot lost then, and a lot of large corporations taking over. We just heard today about AT&T is going to take over Time Warner. That was apparently approved or near approval, another consolidation. So there's more
Wasn't
need.
that being fought by the Trump administration?
Yes. They were fighting it. Many think because of CNN's involvement, that he doesn't like CNN. But the idea that these large corporations are now running most outlets, and they need a bigger profit margin than the smaller local owners of the days past.
The Great Recession was 10 years ago, but they're still making major cuts despite the fact that the economy has recovered pretty much?
Right, but a lot of the advertising economy and a lot of the media economy has not, because it's only been stretched out. It's only been splintered. There's more, as I said earlier, more space on the Internet for different ideas and different outlets, more space in TV and radio, cable, in all these areas that are splintering the dollar, splintering the viewer-reader, and it's harder to get an audience. That's why a lot of news outlets are lowering themselves to get the clickbait, to get the quick, easy story. I do a big piece of a chapter on breaking news. Everything's breaking news now, and how it really isn't breaking.
No, in fact, often they say breaking news, and then you hear the same story you heard 2 hours ago.
And there's actually a few clear anecdotes in the book about stories that were broken in the morning by AP or someone else, and then on the night show on CNN, they called it breaking news when it was 8-10 hours later, and nothing new had happened.
You cite a Pew Research Center study that reported a 37% decline in newspaper jobs from 2005 to 2015. Now, have the jobs increased elsewhere in broadcast or Internet news?
There's been other jobs in other places that have come up a bit because there are more outlets, but the actual job of a journalist, of a news person collecting and reporting news, it continues to fade away, and a lot of it is because a lot of news outlets are coming on the scene, but they don't have the reporters that they used to have. Used to have 10, 20, 30 reporters in a newsroom. Some newsrooms are down to 3, 4, 5. Some barely at all. When do you really see new or investigative, in-depth journalism on Fox? Somewhat more on CNN. MSNBC can use NBC's news, but they don't have the reporters they had 20, 30 years ago either.
And newspapers used to send the cub reporter off to cover meetings of local organizations.
I was one of those cub reporters. I started.
We don't get those stories anymore.
No, I started at the Daily Journal in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and I covered school boards, city council, town council. A lot of that is not done. I live in a small town in New Jersey. We don't get major coverage by local news outlets of our town committee and our school board. There are websites that have come up in their place somewhat, but they don't really cover what the newspapers used to, and that's the news that affects most people.
Because the local reporter would know the politicians and might very well uncover some bad behavior, for example, because he or she was aware of the situation in a way that some other reporter who's being parachuted in could never understand.
Right, and they were on the beat regularly. You got to know the politician, you got to know the issues. I was teaching my class about filing freedom of information requests and telling them sometimes you don't even know what you're looking for. You just want to go through the files, you want to go through the agenda, you want to go to a meeting. Often at an end of a meeting, the mayor or someone will say, well, we're just going to start this project. Oh, really? Let's find out more about it. Wasn't on the agenda. He didn't put it out anywhere. It just came up at a meeting, and everything there is public. And sometimes those are the things
that's the red flag.
Get the story, and now those reporters aren't really there because the news outlets don't have the resources to send them everywhere.
So you started doing those kinds of reports. What have you witnessed firsthand in your 3 decades in journalism?
What do you mean in terms of what I've covered?
All the changes that have occurred.
Well, the 3 of the newspapers I've worked at no longer exist, and I worked at 4 of them. The last one I worked at, the Press Enterprise in Riverside, California, was sold to a larger company and has cut back. I used to work at Editor and Publisher magazine, which covered the newspaper industry. It's still around, but not what it used to be. And then I worked at Media Matters for America, which is, I'm glad, still around, but not the traditional news outlet. It was more of a watchdog group. But a lot of these news outlets are either not around anymore or they're owned more by consolidated companies. When I was in San Francisco, there were a lot more independent news outlets. Now most of the newspapers in the Bay Area, the few that are left, are owned by 1 or 2 companies, and they don't have the staff they used to either.
And we used to have these local newspapers that weren't regular newspapers. The Soho News, well, the Village Voice.
Village Voice is no longer with us either.
And they're no longer with us either.
It's very sad.
Why did they come along at a certain time? What vacuum were they filling, and why do you think they no longer are required or could make a go of it?
I think a lot of it was the alternative news is what they're called. There's still the Association of Alternative News Weeklies, which still has members in different cities. The Village Voice, I think, was really the grandfather of that outlet. When I lived in San Francisco, we had the Bay Guardian, which was another one, and SF Weekly. They're both gone. And they filled the void of the alternative view. A lot of it is online now, to be fair. There are online news outlets that give the alternative voice, no pun intended, that give the sort of liberal view or conversely the conservative view. But many of them are understaffed. Many of them are not required to build an audience or to put forth something that validates their existence. You can create a website in 5 minutes now, and you could put up whatever you want, true or not. And that's one of the problems, that's being done. And there's really little ability to check a lot of places. You kind of have to do your own research and your own background checks on these websites. And a lot of people don't do it, or they don't have the time to do it, or the ability, so they believe what they see, and then that's what gets spread around as a lie and an inaccurate story.
Well, you look to them for the kinds of stories you want to see. That's why certain people looking for certain kinds of conspiracies will go to certain websites. But Breitbart is not being made available on the street corner the way the Village Voice was.
Right.
Anybody could take the Village Voice in those days, whatever their politics and view of the culture. But today, people who look at Breitbart, for example, are people who would probably already agree with pretty much its worldview.
And that's another piece of the news issue today, is that when you have less print and less availability to buy a newspaper, unless you go to your library, a lot of people don't have computer access. A lot of people in low-income neighborhoods, a lot of poor people. There was a situation when the Times-Picayune in New Orleans years ago cut back to, I believe, 3 or 4 days a week of print. And this is, of course, the city that was devastated by Hurricane Katrina years ago, and a lot of it's still not repaired. A lot of poor people or poorer people can't get access to a website or even a cell phone or a laptop, and they don't get the news that they used to. And so a lot of these online sites are not even available to them.
Joe Strupp is my guest on Leonard Lopate at Large today, whose book is called Killing Journalism, How Greed, Laziness, and Donald Trump Are Destroying News, and How We Can Save It. Haven't you taught media ethics?
Yes, I teach a media ethics class at Fairleigh Dickinson University. I'm actually going to be there tonight. I've taught there for the last 2 years that class and also another class. And I also teach, for the first time, social justice journalism at York College in Queens, one of the CUNY schools. And I'm a Brooklyn College CUNY graduate, so I'm glad to be involved there.
How have the ethical questions that journalists face changed over the years?
I don't know if the questions have changed. I think sometimes the answers have sadly changed. There's not so much a bias, in my view, or slanted coverage or outright misrepresentation, but there is laziness. And when I term laziness in the book title is the lack of real in-depth reporting or looking to get a new insight into something or get facts that are uncovered. It's a lot more easy reporting, a lot more easy saying what someone said.
Is that the decision of the journalists or their editors?
I think in most cases it's the editors or it's the situation they're in. They have to get a story out. They have to feed the audience. They have to get people listening, and it's easy to do. The phrase clickbait has come up a lot. That's in the book as well, where you've put out certain words that'll grab people's attention rather than digging up the stories. And a lot of news stories can be boring in terms of if you're talking about the environment, things like the Flint water crisis I write about. That was really not looked at nationally for a while until some outlets came in and looked at the real elements of it, and that can be very boring and scientific, and healthcare in many cases becomes a political story rather than a health or science story. Abortion, I write about how the science elements and the history of that is often misrepresented because it's a political story rather than a healthcare story.
The president talked about abortion in his State of the Union address, and actually
that was kind of surprising, I think.
But
to
it describes something that doesn't happen,
right?
Ripping
the late-term abortions.
Yeah. Out of
one of the things I found in my research was the fact that abortion was essentially legal until about the late 1880s, and it was a regular part of life. There weren't many of them because it was so difficult, and a lot of people didn't want to have abortions. I'm not saying they want to have them now, but it was a lot less common. But it was a legal thing. Just like a lot of things in the Catholic Church, priests were allowed to marry way back, and that's another issue that's come up lately. So sometimes that's part of the misinformation that people don't understand, and it becomes a political or hot-button issue rather than a science issue or a health issue or whatever the real element of it is.
You cite greed in the title of your book. Or are news organizations more driven by a demand for profit than they used to be?
I think many of them are because they're larger conglomerates, because a lot of them are leveraged. This buyout we were talking about today with AT&T, they're going to be having to pay back some loans, I'm sure, or make some shareholders happy. And there's more of the need to either pay off loans or make large profits than there used to be. The smaller papers I used to work for, many of the larger papers were owned by families or small companies. They could get 8 to 10% profits back in the day. That doesn't fly today, as you know.
Didn't the Democrats under Bill Clinton promote consolidation of corporate media with the 1996 Telecommunications Act?
There's been a lot of government support, a lot of it also at the FCC for allowing multiple news outlets, multiple broadcast outlets in the same market, which was not allowed in the past. And look at what Rupert Murdoch owns in New York City alone. He owns several newspapers. He owns several TV stations. That was against the rules just a few decades ago.
Changed the rules.
That's always something politicians like to do, and with big money behind them.
Comcast, Walt Disney, Sony are among the biggest owners in news media. What happens when journalists have to answer to CEOs who have no background in news? You were talking about those small newspapers where probably the owner of the newspaper was the child of the previous owner of the newspaper.
Right, and of course that's the case at the New York Times.
Yeah.
A.G. Sulzberger is the third A. Sulzberger to be publisher of that paper, although I think they're still doing what they used to. But in a lot of places that is the case. There was a story years ago about the Los Angeles Times and the Staples Center special issue they did that split profits with the new venue that housed the basketball and hockey teams, and that led to the firing of the editor and to the publisher. And these were non-news people who were taking over and not looking at the wall between advertising and news. And many other examples when you have, but they don't have to be news people necessarily. They only have to, I think, look at the news ethics and let the news people run things, which is a lot more difficult today because the money situation is so difficult itself.
It could be a two-edged sword. Jeff
Sure.
Bezos owns the Washington Post, and the president goes after Amazon, although I think Amazon is still doing fairly well.
Yes, although not a lot of fans of Amazon in New York City these days. But he did put a lot of money into the Post, too, which I think a lot of people at the paper appreciate, although obviously he's made he's created critics elsewhere. And yes, Trump has gone after him because he's not a fan of the Post. But Trump picks his news outlets that he's going to go after here and there, and he's really not a fan of any of them that are not writing or broadcasting fawning stories about him, as you would not expect them to.
Even if the wealthy don't exert direct influence, does growing inequality affect how the press covers issues like finance or economics or education or healthcare?
Inequality in what? In the way they cover?
Economic
yes.
inequality.
And that is another less covered story today than it should be, I think. The inequality. You see elements of it, the shrinking middle class, but you don't really see a lot of in-depth coverage of how it affects people. There's been some coverage of the Trump tax cut and how it's affecting people right now doing their returns. The New York Times had a big front-page story not too long ago about people being surprised at the lack of refund or higher taxes they're paying. So there's some of that, I think, in that kind of an issue. But yes, that does affect things. But I think it's hard to lump it all together because the overall problem with news, the lack of resources and the grab for audience at any cost is really the overarching issue that brings less real coverage into the fray.
You mentioned working in small-town New Jersey. With two major cities bordering New Jersey, New York and Philadelphia, hasn't there always been pressure to push local news to the back burner?
In terms of the New York and Philadelphia outlets, yeah, they had a lot more coverage of New Jersey than they do today.
Well, although today, if you watch local TV news, it seems to me the first one-third of any news broadcast is about a car accident in New Jersey, a house burning in New Jersey.
Or somewhere
else. But not
the
politics of New Jersey, not the other.
No, absolutely not. The State House is very undercovered, even by the New Jersey papers. Our big paper, the Star-Ledger, doesn't have nearly the staff it had in Trenton back in the day or anywhere else. And it's not their fault. It's economics. They were hit as the same as anyone else, and they're trying to make money or make the same money, and they can't do it with the same kind of staff. And you're right, the New York and Philadelphia outlets don't cover New Jersey like they used to, as much as they don't cover anything like they used to.
But New Jersey still does have the Bergen Record and a few other
still has some good papers. But one of the things is they're all owned by either Advanced, which owns the Star-Ledger, or Gannett. So you have you have single ownership of multiple outlets. Many of them also consolidate coverage. You used to have all these news outlets covering Trenton with 3, 4, 5, 10 reporters. Now you have 1 or 2 reporters who feed news to all these outlets, and you get less variety in what's being covered.
So the op-ed page is pretty much the same of all Gannett papers around the country?
Actually, they're a little bit more localized in their op-eds. A lot of these chains do that. Digital First, which used to be Media News and is now more of a broad-based news company. They own the Denver Post and several others. They were known for years to give their local editorial pages independence. And I think we still see that, but then there's the question of how much influence do they have.
Didn't the Columbia Journalism Review find that local reporting played a key role in defeating Republican efforts to end Obamacare?
Yes. There's a lot of that, and a lot of that we saw in other states.
So it's still having some kind of impact, local
right,
reporting.
But it does have to be a unified effort and a continued effort. Stay on the issue, bring up the new elements of it, do the in-depth reporting, give people a reason to see a certain side of the story or the actual elements and data of the story to begin with.
You mentioned the decline in the use of beat reporters. Is that a reason the Pulitzer Prize for beat reporting was discontinued in 2007?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. They change around the categories a lot in the Pulitzers. I used to cover them every year for editor and publisher, which was still one of my favorite things, and also a good reminder of a lot of great journalism still being done. But they switch their categories around, and they can still find a place for anything they think is worthwhile.
James Brady, who's a former Washington Post web editor, says that all the outlets, we're talking about the digital media outlets, quote, still trickle down on the same things. I'm not sure I understand exactly what he means by that, but I guess he's saying that we get the same stuff from everybody.
In a lot of cases, you do, if it's a broad outlet that's covering the same things as other ones. But on the other hand, I think the web has allowed a lot of niche, has allowed a lot of focused and specific coverage of certain areas. And they've been getting the Pulitzers and the other awards that they deserve. Inside Climate News, which is, I think, only a few blocks from here in Brooklyn, was a Pulitzer winner a few years ago and has really done great work like that, as have a lot of these nonprofit news outlets that I talk about in the book, ProPublica and the Marshall Project and a few others around the country.
Post.
Yes, that are doing real in-depth investigative reporting, and in many cases with mainstream outlets.
CNN, which bills itself as a 24-hour news service, is mostly a string of talk shows that feature panels discussing the same 3 or 4 stories that have been deemed the major stories of the day. So at a certain point, at least I find myself tuning away simply because, oh, gee, I heard another panel pretty much say the same thing on the previous show that I'm hearing from this group.
Right, and that is one of the real problems, I think, the way it's devolved, because they have to cut back the resources, so you're not having regularly updated news every hour. I was a CNN intern in 1988 when it was essentially one long news report, and you would have every hour, you'd have the big story of the day, then you'd have 7, 8, 9 stories, and you'd update it as they went along, all up until Larry King Live, which in itself was pretty newsmaking at the time as well. But now every show is some kind of cross between a celebrity personality person, whether it's Jake Tapper or it used to be Bill O'Reilly, now other voices, or
Anderson Cooper
or Rachel Maddow, whoever the person is, giving their view of what the story is. And in many cases, they're giving the accuracy. I think Rachel Maddow is actually a very good in-depth researcher, but there's always that opinion that goes along with it. There's a difference, I think, between slanting a story in an inaccurate way and giving your opinion on it while giving accurate information. You say, this is what happened, this is the fact, but it means this and this, or it means that and that. That's a little bit disturbing to me, because it should be the straight fact and let the viewer decide what to think about it. But now we have people telling the viewer what to think about it.
So what would you like to see happen? Well, there's a reason for this. I guess it's economic. Is it easier for them to do it this way than to run CNN the way, let's say, the nightly news shows are run on the major networks?
Yeah, and even they've changed a bit, although not greatly. The evening news that you saw 20 years ago is somewhat similar in having the anchor, having them throw to stories. It's a half hour. It's a general look at the national news.
Although David Muir always has to end with some kind of upbeat story.
Well, that used to happen in the old days, but not as much on the national level. But you're right, it's the news channels that have changed a lot. And a lot of it is economic. It's easier to put a bunch of people on and let them hash it out and maybe have some news updated rather than have real in-depth stories and go out and do some research. And a lot of it is viewership. People get bored easily nowadays because they have so many options. If you don't like what you're seeing on CNN, you can go to some other channel. You can go to your phone. You can go to your laptop. You can go to YouTube. It's tough to get that audience to stay put, but that's not necessarily a good thing for the journalism.
A number of lawyers and researchers you interviewed reported seeing a higher number of cases being brought against the press. Conversely, are journalists using the laws effectively when officials, public or private, try to block access to their information?
That's another whole chapter in the book about what I call affording the First Amendment. The money put aside for legal protection is diminishing because a lot of news outlets don't have it. They don't put the efforts into defending their reporters and journalists or into seeking information. Freedom of information requests. The backlog is huge. Another thing I found in Washington, federal FOI requests some have backlogs 20 years, and people are not seeking that information as much as they used to. And when they're getting sued, as a couple of the lawyers told me in the book, it's a lot more nasty. It's a lot angrier. And the president is pushing this as much as anyone, wanting to even change libel laws. And there was a disturbing story last week, Clarence Thomas himself bringing up the idea that maybe we should rethink the Sullivan case that really set the standard for what's malice in a libel suit.
That goes back to 1964.
Yes, the New York Times case. And
What's his reasoning?
You'd have to ask him. He didn't really have much reasoning. I think the thought was we need to make it easier to sue news outlets because so many of them are fake news, as they would claim, and that so many of them are inaccurate. And when in reality, it's another way to protect politicians and protect those who don't want the real news out.
The president even wanted to go after Saturday Night Live.
Yes, and I found that odd. There's so many things about this president dealing with the media that are strange and have never really been seen before. And he's the first real Twitter president, which I think is part of it. I think if we had Twitter back in Nixon's day, who knows what he would have tweeted.
Do you know whether journalism is also suffering in other industrial democracies? Britain, France, Germany, Japan?
The danger in journalism is, if you look at the Committee to Protect Journalists, that great international organization that tracks news, violence against news people, the numbers are up on violent attacks and murder of journalists overseas, and a lot of people believe the Trump anti-press fervor has spread overseas as well and allowed other countries to see more of this. We saw it in a lot of the cases in France and in some of the Muslim-related criticisms that drew violence against the news outlets there. But yeah, I think it's definitely caused an impact overseas.
China is rapidly becoming the world's economic power,
Yes.
the number one, and it has little or no press freedom. Could that influence press trends around the world? Because haven't some American media organizations already altered their coverage of some issues in order to avoid angering the Chinese government?
I haven't done a lot of investigation of that, but yes, what I've heard from especially the Committee to Protect Journalists, there is that impact when such a huge country and population and growing power as China, but also Trump's involvement with it as well. He seems to like, he's meeting now with the dictator of North Korea. He's met with Putin and supports Putin. He seems to like these dictators and suppressive areas, and we might see more of that here. But I think a lot of it is that people's fear of being retaliated against could stop them from going after certain stories. And also the public reaction. There's so much public anti-press sentiment, not just because of Trump, but years of politicians going after news outlets, making people believe they're biased, making people believe they're telling things that aren't true, when in reality they are, as Thomas Jefferson and others said, this is the first pillar of democracy, or one of them. And if you don't have journalists covering the news, then you're not going to have anyone keeping an eye on the powers that be, as David Halberstam wrote.
It spreads pretty far. Were you surprised when Netflix pulled an episode of Hassan Minhaj's show about Saudi Arabia?
I'm not surprised when a lot of these companies do things that will help them stay away from controversy. It goes from an outlet that doesn't want to look like they're supporting a certain side or another, and another just doesn't want to have criticism or protest. A lot of that we saw with the Colin Kaepernick issues with the NFL. They don't want to deal with the controversy. They handle it very badly in many ways, but that's a sports outlet. With news outlets and media outlets, sure, plenty of them are going to cut programming that just brings something negative to them. It's more of a business decision, I think, than any kind of journalistic or biased decision.
Other than writing books like this, what else are you doing? You have a podcast?
I have, yes, called The Retro Room, which looks at vintage TV and radio. I also have one called Joe's Media Corner. And my web blog is struppblog.net. And I am also a freelance writer for New Jersey Monthly and several other news outlets. But yeah, you can see hear both my podcasts at anchor.fm, and you can see links to everything I do on my website, joestrupp.com, or follow me at Twitter at joestrupp.
And Joe Strupp's book is Killing Journalism, How Greed, Laziness, and Donald Trump Are Destroying News and How We Can Save It. It's published by Willow Street Press. Thank you so much for being on our show.
Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of today's show. My great thanks to Joe Strupp, to Hugh Sansom, who produced this segment, to Reggie Johnson, who is at the audio controls, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, and to my executive producer, Jesse Lent. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.